Dean Martin sat alone in his Beverly Hills mansion, a half-empty bottle of bourbon on the mahogany desk beside him. But for the first time in 20 years, the alcohol wasn't touching the pain. His hands trembled as he picked up a Mont Blanc pen, the same pen Frank Sinatra had given him for his birthday 3 months earlier. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was about to write the most honest words of his life, and they might be his last. The letter was addressed to no one. It was simply titled, "The Truth," and what Dean Martin wrote over the next 4 hours would remain hidden for 30 years, locked away in a safety deposit box that his family never knew existed. When it was finally discovered in 1999, it would shatter everything the world thought they knew about the King of Cool. But to understand why Dean Martin was writing what he called his suicide note on that rainy November night, we have to go back 6 months earlier. We have to go back to the night his carefully constructed world began to collapse, piece by piece, until all that remained was a man staring into the abyss of his own soul. It started with a phone call, May 21st, 1969. Dean was in his dressing room at NBC, preparing for another taping of The Dean Martin Show. The variety show was at the peak of its success, drawing 30 million viewers every week. America loved watching Dino stumble around the stage, pretending to be drunk, cracking jokes with beautiful women and famous guests. What they didn't know was that the man they were watching was slowly dying inside. The phone rang at 7:47 p.m. Dean almost didn't answer it. He was tired, bone-deep, soul-crushing tired, the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix. But something made him pick up. "Mr. Martin?" The voice on the other end was young, nervous. "This is Dr. Patricia Williamson from Cedars-Sinai. I'm calling about your recent blood work." Dean's heart stopped. He had gone for a routine physical 3 weeks earlier, mainly to get his insurance company off his back. He'd been having chest pains, shortness of breath, episodes where his vision went dark around the edges. But he'd attributed it to stress, to the endless cycle of performances, recordings, and appearances that had defined his life for 20 years. "What about it?" Dean asked, his voice steady despite the panic rising in his throat. "Mr. Martin, I need you to come in immediately. Tonight, if possible. There are some irregularities we need to discuss." "What kind of irregularities?" Dr. Williamson hesitated. "I'd rather discuss this in person." That hesitation told Dean everything he needed to know. In 45 minutes, he would be sitting in a sterile hospital room, learning that his liver was failing. The decades of drinking, real drinking, not the stage prop scotch, had finally caught up with him. Dr. Williamson would use words like cirrhosis and irreversible damage. She would talk about treatment options, lifestyle changes, the possibility of a transplant. But what Dean heard was a death sentence. "How long?" he asked quietly. "With aggressive treatment, dietary changes, complete abstinence from alcohol. Maybe 5 years. Maybe 10 if we're lucky." Dean Martin walked out of that hospital at 11:30 p.m. feeling like a ghost. He didn't go home. Instead, he drove to the beach in Malibu and sat on the sand until dawn, watching the waves crash against the shore. For the first time in his adult life, he cried. Not the theatrical tears of a performance, but raw, ugly sobs that seemed to tear something loose inside his chest. The next morning, Dean Martin walked onto the set of his TV show and gave the performance of his life. He joked with his guests, flirted with the gold diggers, and sang "Everybody Loves Somebody" with such warmth and charm that the audience gave him a standing ovation. But behind his eyes, something had changed. The light that had made him America's sweetheart was flickering like a candle in the wind. Over the next 6 months, Dean began a careful campaign of self-destruction. He started drinking more heavily than ever before, real alcohol now, not the apple juice and ginger ale he usually used for his drunk persona. He would sit alone in his mansion for hours, staring at family photos, wondering how he had become so isolated from everyone who mattered. The truth was, Dean Martin had been living a lie for so long that he had forgotten who he really was. The cool, carefree entertainer was a character he played, as fictional as any movie role. The real Dean, Dino Crocetti from Steubenville, Ohio, was a sensitive, deeply troubled man who had never learned how to connect with people without performing for them. His marriage to Jean was crumbling. They had been growing apart for years, but Dean's diagnosis had accelerated the process. He couldn't tell her about the liver disease. He couldn't tell anyone. So he simply withdrew, became more distant, more cold. Jean thought he was having an affair. The truth was worse. He was having an affair with death. His children felt the change too. Dean Paul, his beloved son, had tried to reach out several times. But Dean pushed him away with jokes and deflections the same way he pushed everyone away. He was terrified that if people saw the real him, scared, sick, slowly dying, they would abandon him. So he abandoned them first. The breaking point came on November 10th, 1969. Dean was performing at the Copa Room in Las Vegas, going through the motions of his usual act. Halfway through That's Amore, he forgot the words. Not just a line or two, but entire verses. He stood there in the spotlight, mouth open, no sound coming out. The audience thought it was part of the bit and laughed. But Dean knew better. His mind was starting to go, another casualty of the disease eating him alive. He finished the show somehow, but backstage, he collapsed. His road manager, Mac Gray, found him on the floor of his dressing room, conscious but unable to speak. The official story was exhaustion. Dean was back on stage the next night. But privately, he knew he was running out of time. That's when he decided to write the letter. November 15th, 1969. Dean sat at his desk, looking out at the lights of Los Angeles spread below him like a glittering carpet. He had sent his staff home early. Jean was at her sister's house in Palm Springs. The mansion felt like a mausoleum, beautiful, expensive, and utterly empty. He started writing, "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. Not just dead. I've been dead for months now. Dead inside. Dead in every way that matters. The man you knew, the man you thought you loved, was never real. He was a costume I put on every morning and took off every night. My name is Dino Crocetti. I was born in Steubenville, Ohio, on June 7th, 1917. My father was a barber. My mother cleaned houses. We were poor, but we were real. When I became Dean Martin, I lost that reality. I became a ghost haunting my own life. I'm dying. My liver is shot from 20 years of drowning my feelings in whiskey. But that's not why I'm writing this. I'm writing this because I want someone, somewhere, to know who I really was before I disappear completely. I was scared. Every day, every performance, every interview. I was terrified that people would see through the act and realize I wasn't special. I wasn't cool. I was just a frightened kid from Ohio who got lucky. I loved my children, but I didn't know how to show them. I loved my wives, but I didn't know how to be a husband. I loved my friends, but I kept them at arm's length because I was afraid they would leave me like everyone else had left me. The worst part is the loneliness. You can be surrounded by thousands of people, hearing them laugh at your jokes, seeing them smile when you sing, and still feel completely alone. That's been my life for 20 years. Alone in a crowd, dying slowly while everyone applauds. Frank thinks he knows me. Sammy thinks he knows me. They know Dean Martin. They never met Dino Crocetti. He died somewhere along the way, suffocated by success and strangled by expectations. If there's a God, and if he's listening, I hope he'll forgive me for what I'm about to do. I can't pretend anymore. I can't keep smiling when my heart is breaking. I can't keep being Dean Martin when all I want is to be myself again. Tell my children I love them more than they'll ever know. Tell Jean she deserved better than a man who was too cowardly to let her love the real him. Tell Frank and Sammy that the Rat Pack was the best thing that ever happened to me, even if I was too scared to really let them in. And tell the world that Dean Martin was just a role I played. I hope I played it well enough to make people happy. But I'm tired of performing. I'm ready for the final curtain. Goodbye, Dino. Dean sealed the letter in an envelope and placed it in his personal safe, next to his will and other important documents. But as he sat there in the darkness, something stopped him from taking the next step. Maybe it was cowardice. Maybe it was hope. Or maybe it was the sound of a car pulling into his driveway. Jean had come home early. Dean quickly hid the letter and went downstairs to greet his wife. She looked at him with concern. His eyes were red from crying, his hands still shaking from the emotional purge of writing those words. "Dean, are you all right?" For a moment he considered telling her everything. About the diagnosis, about the letter, about the decades of loneliness and fear that had brought him to this point. But the habits of a lifetime were too strong. "Just tired, baby. Long day." Jean studied his face, seeing something she couldn't quite identify. "Are you sure? You look different." Dean forced a smile, the same smile that had charmed millions of people. "Never better, doll. How about a nightcap?" But he didn't drink that night. Instead, he sat with Jean on their patio, talking about nothing important, watching the stars appear one by one in the clear November sky. And for the first time in months, the pain in his chest eased just a little. The letter remained in his safe for the next 30 years. Dean never showed it to anyone, never spoke of it again. But something about writing it had changed him. He didn't stop drinking entirely, but he cut back. He started calling his children more often, making an effort to be present instead of just performing. He even told Jean about his health problems, though he downplayed the severity. Most importantly, he began to let people see glimpses of the real Dino Crocetti. Not often, and not for long, but enough to remind himself that somewhere inside the King of Cool was a human being who deserved to be loved for who he was, not what he did. Dean Martin lived for 26 more years after writing that letter. He never attempted suicide again, though the temptation was sometimes overwhelming. He learned to manage his disease, to find meaning in small moments of connection with family and friends. He never completely shed the Dean Martin persona, but he found ways to let Dino breathe. The letter was discovered in 1999, 4 years after Dean's death, when his estate was being settled. His daughter Dina found it in a safety deposit box that no one knew existed, along with other personal items Dean had wanted to keep private. She read it with tears streaming down her face, finally understanding the depth of pain her father had carried throughout his life. In 2019, Deanna Martin made the difficult decision to share excerpts from the letter in a documentary about her father's life. She wanted people to understand that behind the laughter and the songs was a man struggling with demons that fame and fortune couldn't cure. "My father was the strongest person I knew," Dina said in the documentary, "but he was also the most vulnerable." This letter shows both sides of him, the despair that almost destroyed him, and the courage that kept him going. The revelation of Dean Martin's secret depression and near suicide shocked the entertainment world. Here was a man who had seemed effortlessly happy, eternally cool, someone who had made millions of people smile. The idea that he had been fighting such darkness was almost incomprehensible. But perhaps that's the most important lesson of Dean Martin's hidden letter. Behind every smile, there might be tears. Behind every laugh, there might be a scream. And sometimes, the people who bring us the most joy are the ones who need it most themselves. Frank Sinatra once said that Dean Martin was the most honest performer he had ever known. Frank was right, but not in the way he thought. Dean's honesty wasn't in his performances, it was in his pain. The sadness that leaked through his songs, the vulnerability that occasionally flickered in his eyes, the humanity that made him more than just an entertainer. Dean Martin spent his life pretending to be drunk while staying stone sober. He pretended to be careless while actually caring too much. He pretended to be untouchable while desperately needing to be touched. And on one November night in 1969, he almost stopped pretending altogether. But he didn't. He found the strength to keep going, to keep fighting, to keep being the complicated, contradictory, beautiful human being he was. And in doing so, he gave us something more valuable than any song or movie. Proof that it's possible to survive our darkest moments, even when we can't see the light. The letter Dean Martin never wanted found ultimately became his greatest gift to the world. Not because it showed his weakness, but because it showed his strength. The strength to write down his pain, to seal it away, and then to choose life over death, hope over despair, love over loneliness. Dean Martin may have died on Christmas Day in 1995, but Dino Crocetti, the real man behind the legend, lives on in that letter. Honest, afraid, broken, and ultimately triumphant. Because in the end, he didn't let the darkness win. He found a way to let the light back in. The King of Cool's coolest move was learning how to be warm again. And that warmth, that humanity, that refusal to give up, that's the real legacy of Dean Martin. Not the songs or the movies or the jokes, but the reminder that even our heroes struggle, and that struggling doesn't make us weak. It makes us human. And sometimes, being human is the bravest thing of all. In the final analysis, Dean Martin's secret letter reveals a truth about fame that we often forget. The people who entertain us are human beings first, performers second. They have fears and insecurities, dreams and disappointments, just like the rest of us. The only difference is that they have to carry that burden while the world watches, expecting them to always be on, always be perfect. Dean Martin carried that burden for 40 years, and for one brief moment in 1969, it almost crushed him. But he found the strength to keep going, to keep giving joy to others even when he couldn't find it for himself. And in the end, that may be the most heroic thing of all. The letter remains in the Martin family archives now, a testament to one man's struggle with the demons that fame couldn't exorcise. It serves as a reminder that behind every public figure is a private person, and that sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply choosing to live another day. Dean Martin, the King of Cool, who learned that it was okay to be human. The performer who discovered that the greatest role he could play was himself. And the man who proved that even in our darkest moments, there's always hope for a new dawn. That's the real story of Dean Martin's secret letter. Not the story of a man who almost gave up, but the story of a man who found the strength to hold on. And in holding on, he gave us all permission to do the same.